Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Welcome to the course Principle in Animal Life 2. This is lecture number 36. The topic is the process of evolution. How does natural selection work? Discussing agenda for the topic is the process of evolution, Darwin's four postulates, the biological definition of fitness, adaptation, and selection. Lecture outcome. After watching and listening this lecture, students will be able to explain how evolution occurs. Introduction. The process of evolution. How does natural selection work? Darwin's greatest contribution did not lie in recognizing the fact of evolution. Several researchers before Darwin coined in the fact that the species are not fixed, they do change with the passage of time. These researchers included Lamarck, Greek philosophers, the grandfather of Darwin, that is Erasmus Darwin. They were of the opinion that the species do change with the passage of time, but Darwin is renowned for the fact that he proposed a mechanism for evolution, and that mechanism is called natural selection, that could explain the pattern of descent with modification. Natural selection is a process where the organisms having inherited beneficial traits increases their number. Such beneficial traits are propagated in the population, whereas the organisms which have traits that are not favorable to the prevailing environmental conditions, such organisms are slowly and gradually eliminated from the population. To begin, Darwin had spent decades exploring and documenting the diversity of plants and animals both around the globe and in his native England. Darwin was born in 1809 in Shrewsbury, England. In his childhood, he was interested in nature, in collecting the specimen of animals. When he was only 20 years old, he began his 5-year journey on HMS Beagle around the world, where he had opportunity to observe the rich diversity around the world. He observed the living forms as well as the fossils and noted the similarities and the differences between the animals and plants. And upon his return, he spent a lot of time to formulate, to devise a mechanism which is responsible for the change, which is responsible for the similarities and the differences between the species. So he had a wealth of data on variation within and among species, and he viewed his variation in the context of the ancient and changing earth as popularized by his geologist friend Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell presented the idea of gradualism, which says that certain forces are slowly and gradually changing the shape of the earth, and these forces are still operating. So these statements of Charles Lyell provided an idea to Darwin that if such forces are in operation and these forces are operating at a slow and gradual pace, then the age of the earth must be much, much older than 6,000 years. And if such forces are acting on the physical environment, then it is very much possible that the biological systems are also under the effect of such forces, and these forces are also modifying the biological systems and the living organisms. All of his careful work gave Darwin an especially strong foundation in the pattern of evolution. To make sense of the process of evolution, Darwin turned in part to pigeon breeding, a model system that would be easier to study and manipulate than population in the wild. So, as already discussed, that in natural selection, the nature selects the favorable traits in the population, and the organisms with the favorable traits survive and thrive and increase in number. And on the other hand, the breeders, the animal breeders, also carry out the same process in a confined environment where they choose two organisms having favorable traits. They cross these two organisms with an intention to produce a hybrid which has the favorable characteristics of both parents. So pigeon breeding was popular in England at the time, and in Darwin's words, the diversity of the breeds is something astonishing. Means there were lots of varieties of pigeon breeds available at that time, which amused Darwin. Darwin crossbreed pigeons and observed how characteristics were passed on to offsprings. He could choose certain individuals with desirable traits to reproduce, thus manipulating the composition of the population by a process called artificial selection. Means some of the pigeons in a particular population had beautiful camouflage, or they had a great ability to fly for long hours. So the Darwin was in a position to increase the number of those particular individuals by breeding them again and again. It was clear to Darwin and other breeders that the diverse varieties were all descendants from the wild rock pigeons. So the animals were originally originated in the wild and then they were domesticated. So it was very much evident to Darwin that initially all those pigeons which were domesticated had their origin in the wild. Another influence on Darwin was the publication of a book by Thomas Robert Malthus, an essay on the principle of population, which inspired heated discussion in England at that time. Malthus' studies of human population in England and elsewhere led him to a startling conclusion. What was the conclusion? Since many more individuals are born than can survive, a struggle for existence occurs as people compete for food and place to live. So Thomas Malthus said that the humans have the ability to produce. Similarly, other animals also have this remarkable ability to produce. If you observe the animals in the wild, the amphibians and the fishes lay millions of eggs. Insects lay hundreds of thousands of eggs, and very few of them mature and they reaches the reproductive age. The rest of them are eliminated. Why? Because there is a competition for food, for shelter, for space. So there is a struggle for survival, there is a struggle for existence amongst individuals. The same kind of struggle also takes place in human population. Darwin combined his observations of artificial selection with his notion of struggle for existence in natural population, which he knew for his countless studies contained variation. So Darwin initially was interested in crossing and producing hybrid pigeons, in crossing those pigeons which had favorable characteristics, and then he came to know about the statements of Thomas Malthus that there is a struggle for existence. So he related that statement with his own work and found that the organisms which have favorable characteristics have more advantage for survival and existence over the ones who does not have favorable characteristics. So the organisms which have favorable characteristics, those organisms survive, they reproduce, they increase in number. Those favorable characteristics are spread in the population. The number of organisms carrying those favorable characteristics increase in number. From this synthesis arose his concept of natural selection. Natural selection means nature selects the best, the survival of the fittest to the prevailing environmental conditions. Although both Darwin and Wallace arrived at the same idea, Darwin's name is more closely associated with natural selection because of his extensive evidence for it on the origin of species. In the previous lectures, we have already discussed that Alfred Wallace was another researcher, and he carried out his own studies independently. He formulated his findings into a manuscript, and then he sent his manuscript to Charles Lyell for a review before publishing. Charles Lyell shared that manuscript with Darwin, and Darwin was astonished that his own findings were amazingly similar to the ones documented by Alfred Wallace. But here Charles Darwin got more fame for the fact that he devised a mechanism for the change, and that mechanism was natural selection. Here you can see the different breeds of pigeons. So Darwin's four postulates. Darwin distilled the process of evolution by natural selection into four postulates that form a logical sequence. So it was a kind of a summary, a kind of an abstract of his theory of natural selection, theory of evolution by means of natural selection. What were those four postulates? The first one is variation exists among individual organisms that make up a population. Now, let me remind you that Darwin's time there was no concept of genes, no concept of DNA. Nobody had any idea of alleles. So he still used this terminology, variation, that the organisms, they vary, they do have differences with each other, even if they belonging to the same population, and these variations may be in their size and in their shape. And now, on the basis of our current knowledge, we do know that these differences can be attributed to the fact that the genes may exist in different forms, which are called alleles. So the different alleles are responsible for variations for a particular character. Some of the trait differences are heritable, meaning that are passed on to the offsprings. For example, parent flowers with long petals tend to have offsprings with long petals. Survival and reproductive success is highly variable, means some organisms have greater ability to survive and leave more offsprings, whereas other organisms don't have that much of an ability for those two traits. The subset of individuals that survive best and produce the most offsprings is not a random sample of the population. Instead, individuals with certain heritable traits are more likely to survive and reproduce, means in every population there are certain specific individuals which possess some specific favorable traits, and because of the possession of those favorable traits, these organisms have a higher advantage of survival and reproduction. Although natural selection occurs when the individuals with certain heritable traits produce more surviving offspring than do individuals without those traits. Thus, the frequency of the selected traits increases from one generation to the next. So obviously, if the organisms which have traits that are favorable to the prevailing environmental conditions are able to reproduce and leave more offspring, then their number will automatically increase, whereas the organisms which have traits that are not favorable to the prevailing environmental conditions will not be able to reproduce, and their number will decrease with the passage of time, and eventually they will disappear and become extinct. So biologists now know that traits are determined by alleles, particular version of genes. Thus, the outcome of evolution by natural selection is a change in allele frequency in a population over time. In the subsequent lectures, we will discuss allele frequency and genotype frequency. Initially, we have already discussed the process of evolution. We defined evolution as a change in the genetic composition of a population. Genetic composition is the allele frequency and the genotype frequency of a population. Both of them comprises the gene pool. So in studying these criteria, you should realize that variation among individuals in a population is essential if evolution is to occur. So variation, difference must take place, and then this difference must be selected by nature. Only then a population will evolve. In the coming lectures, we will study the agents which are responsible for evolution. One of the agents is also mutation. Now majority of the mutations are harmful, they are lethal, they decreases the fitness of the organisms, but mutations do bring change in the genotype and allele frequencies. So we can say, we simply define mutation as change in allele and genotype frequency. So any change, whether favorable or not favorable, bring about by mutation can be termed as evolution, but whether this change is favorable or not favorable is decided by natural selection. So natural selection is adaptive. It is the only mechanism which is adaptive, the only agent which is adaptive. Darwin had to introduce population thinking into biology because it is population that change over time. So the individuals does not evolve, but the population evolve. If a single individual change, we cannot say that evolution has occurred, but if a group of individuals change and they keep on producing, then we say that they have evolved. To come up with these postulates and understand their consequences, Darwin had to think in a revolutionary way. Today, biologists usually condense Darwin's four postulates into a two-part statement that more forcefully communicate the essence of evolution by natural selection. So, evolution by natural selection occurs when heritable variation leads to differential reproductive success, means variations are inherited and those variations enable the organism to produce in a more successful way and leave more offsprings, and they have a more survival advantage over their counterparts. So now we discussed the natural selection and the Thomas Malthus statement of the struggle for existence. So now we discussed fitness, adaptation, and selection. To explain the process of natural selection, Darwin referred to successful individuals as more fit than other individuals. In doing so, he gave the word fitness a definition different from its everyday English usage. Biological fitness is the ability of an individual to produce surviving fertile offsprings relative to that ability in other individuals in population. So from a biological point of view, an organism is designated as fit if it has greater ability of reproduction and leaving fertile offsprings as compared to other members of the population. Note that fitness is a measurable quantity, so it is a quantitative trait, not a qualitative trait. When researchers study a population in lab or in field, they can estimate the relative fitness of individuals by comparing the number of surviving offsprings each individual produce. Relative fitness means as compared to others. So if 5 individuals are there in a population, so how many offsprings are produced by the first individual in relation to other individuals? The concept of fitness in turn provides a compact way of formally defining adaptation. The biological meaning of adaptation, like the biological meaning of fitness, is different from its everyday English usage. In evolutionary biology, an adaptation is a heritable trait that increases the fitness of an individual in a particular environment relative to individuals lacking the trait. Now, the two terminologies, fitness and adaptation, have different meanings in biology as compared to pure English. In biology, the word fitness means the organism which leave more offsprings and those offsprings has the ability to survive, and similarly the adaptation means heritable traits that increases the fitness of an individual in a particular environment relative to individuals lacking the trait. So we say that that particular organism is more adaptable as compared to others. Adaptation increases fitness. Now these two terminologies are related with each other. If an organism has favorable traits, it will leave more offsprings, more viable offsprings. Lastly, the term selection has a common sense meaning in the context of artificial selection. Breeders choose which characteristics they want to keep or get rid of in their plant and animal breeds. However, selection has a very different meaning in the biological context of natural selection. Here, it refers to a passive process, differential reproduction as a result of heritable variation, not a purposeful choice. So, in artificial selection, the selection process is usually done by the breeders. The breeders select for the traits which they want to propagate in the population, which they want to incorporate in the hybrids. But here in the evolutionary biology, the selection means those the ability of differential reproduction means any characteristic, any trait, any genetic variation which enables the organism to leave more offsprings, to produce more surviving fertile individuals as compared to others. Obviously, it is a natural process which occurs on its own. This was the end of the lecture. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.